royal palace of the Persian Empire was a sprawling labyrinth of marble and gold, a testament to the wealth and power that Cyrus the Great had amassed through years of conquest. Its halls were vast, lined with columns that seemed to stretch toward the heavens, their surfaces adorned with intricate carvings of battles won and lands subjugated. But tonight, the opulence of the palace seemed muted, as if the very stones had absorbed the despair that hung in the air like a heavy shroud. Cyrus the Great sat alone in the dim light of his private chamber, a vast room draped in rich tapestries and filled with the spoils of his many victories. The flickering light of a single oil lamp cast long shadows on the walls, distorting the regal figures depicted in the tapestries into grotesque shapes that seemed to mock him. He had always taken pride in his conquests, in the empire he had built through sheer force of will and relentless ambition. But now, as he stared into the flame, all he could see were the faces of his fallen soldiers, the walls of Babylon that had withstood his might, and the cold, calculating eyes of Ira, the warrior who had defied him at every turn. 3 times he had marched his armies against Babylon, and 3 times he had been driven back, his forces broken and demoralized. Each defeat had cut deeper than the last, not just in the loss of men and resources, but in the blow it had dealt to his pride, to the image of invincibility he had so carefully cultivated. He was Cyrus the Great, the conqueror of empires, the ruler of a vast dominion that stretched from the Indus to the Aegean. And yet, Babylon, a single city, had proven to be his undoing. The memory of his last defeat was still fresh in his mind, the sight of his soldiers fleeing from the walls of Babylon, their ranks decimated by Ira's relentless onslaught. He could still hear the screams of the dying, the clash of steel, the roar of the flames as they consumed his war machines. And above it all, the image of Ira, standing atop the battlements, his sword raised in defiance, his eyes burning with a fire that refused to be quenched. Cyrus clenched his fists, the muscles in his jaw tightening as he struggled to suppress the anger that boiled within him. He had never known defeat like this, had never been forced to confront the possibility that his dreams of an empire without equal might be shattered by a single city. And yet, as much as he hated to admit it, the reality was undeniable. Babylon had become a symbol of his failure, a stain on his legacy that he could not erase. He had tried every strategy, every tactic that had served him so well in the past, but nothing had worked. His spies had failed to uncover any weaknesses in the city's defenses. His siege engines had been destroyed before they could breach the walls, and his attempts to starve the city into submission had been met with nothing but stubborn resistance. It was as if the very gods had conspired against him, refusing to grant him the victory that he so desperately sought. For the first time in his life, Cyrus found himself questioning his own abilities, doubting the strength of his resolve. Had he grown too old, too complacent? Had the years of success made him blind to the possibility of failure? These questions gnawed at him, eroding the confidence that had been his greatest asset. And yet, beneath the doubt, there was still a flicker of the fire that had driven him to greatness, a fire that refused to be extinguished, no matter how many defeats he suffered. It was in this moment of introspection, as he grappled with his inner demons, that the door to his chamber creaked open, and Ninmagus entered. Her presence was like a cold wind that swept through the room, chilling the air and casting the already dim light into deeper shadow. She moved with the grace of a predator, her dark robes flowing around her like the wings of a raven, her eyes gleaming with a knowing intensity. "Cyrus," she said, her voice smooth and melodious, yet tinged with a darkness that made his skin crawl. "I see that the weight of defeat weighs heavily on you." Cyrus looked up at her, his expression hardening. He had never fully trusted Ninmagus, despite the power she wielded, despite the promises she had made. There was something about her that unsettled him, something in the way she moved, in the way she spoke, that made him feel as if he were dealing with a force of nature rather than a mere mortal. "What do you want, Ninmagus?" he asked, his tone guarded. "I have no patience for your riddles tonight." Ninmagus smiled, a slow, enigmatic smile that revealed nothing of her true intentions. "I come not to offer riddles, but solutions. You have faced defeat, yes, But all is not lost. There is still a way to bring Babylon to its knees, to claim the victory that has eluded you. Cyrus narrowed his eyes, suspicion flickering in their depths. And what would you suggest? Another failed strategy? Another attempt to breach their walls, only to be driven back once more? No, Ninmagus replied, her voice as smooth as silk. This time, we must think beyond conventional warfare. We must strike at the heart of Babylon's strength, at the very thing that has allowed them to defy you time and again. And what is that? Cyrus demanded, his frustration evident. Ninmagus stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. Ira. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of all that it represented. Cyrus felt a surge of anger at the mention of Ira, the warrior who had become his greatest adversary, the thorn in his side that he could not remove. Ira is a formidable foe, Ninmagus continued, her voice taking on a darker tone. But he is not invincible. He has weaknesses, vulnerabilities that we can exploit. But first, we must lure him out, away from the safety of the city, away from the walls that protect him. Cyrus frowned, his mind racing as he tried to grasp the full meaning of her words. And how do you propose we do that? Ninmagus's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with a dark, malevolent light. By offering him something he cannot refuse, his people. Babylon is more than just a city to Ira. It is his home, his sanctuary. He has taken on the mantle of its protector, and he will not stand idly by while his people are threatened. Cyrus leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he considered her words. You mean to use the people of Babylon as bait? Exactly, Ninmagus replied, her voice dripping with satisfaction. We will create a situation that forces Ira to act, that draws him out of the city and into the open, where he will be vulnerable. And when that moment comes, I will be there to deal with him personally. Cyrus felt a shiver run down his spine at the coldness in her voice, at the sheer ruthlessness of her plan. But even as his instincts warned him to be cautious, to reject her offer, he felt the lure of victory pulling him in, tempting him with the promise of finally bringing an end to this cursed war. And what of the city itself? He asked, his voice low. What happens to Babylon once Ira is dealt with? Ninmagus's smile took on a sinister edge, her eyes gleaming with a darkness that seemed to swallow the light. Babylon will fall. The city's treasures, its wealth, its very soul will be ours for the taking. And the people, well, let's just say that they will serve a higher purpose. Cyrus felt a flicker of unease at her words, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the prospect of victory, of finally ending the nightmare that had plagued him for so long. And how do you intend to accomplish all of this? He asked, his voice steady, though his mind churned with questions. Ninmagus stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. The beasts of the wild will be our allies. The monsters that dwell in the forests, the deserts, the mountains, they will answer my call. They will be the key to our victory, the force that will break Babylon from within. Cyrus stared at her, his mind struggling to grasp the full extent of her plan. The idea of using such creatures, of unleashing them upon the city, was both terrifying and exhilarating. It was a strategy unlike any he had ever considered, one that went beyond the bounds of traditional warfare, into the realm of the unknown. And you believe these beasts will be enough to bring down Babylon? He asked, his voice laced with skepticism. Ninmagus's smile was cold, confident. With my magic, they will be more than enough. They will burrow beneath the walls, bypassing the defenses that have repelled your armies. They will enter the city unseen, undetected, and once inside, they will wreak havoc, tearing the city apart from within. And while the people of Babylon are consumed by fear and chaos, you will strike from without, crushing what remains of their resistance. Cyrus was silent for a long moment, his mind weighing the risks and rewards of her plan. It was a gamble, a dangerous one, but it was also the only option that offered a real chance of victory. Finally, he nodded, his decision made. Very well, Ninmagus. We will proceed with your plan. But know this, if you fail, if Babylon does not fall, the consequences will be dire. Ninmagus inclined her head, her smile never faltering. You need not worry, Cyrus. Babylon will fall. and with it the last remnants of resistance, the seed of doubt. As the night deepened, Cyrus was left alone with his thoughts, the echoes of his conversation with Ninmagus lingering in his mind like a dark cloud. He had agreed to her plan, had committed himself to a course of action that went against everything he had ever known, everything he had ever believed in. The use of dark magic, the summoning of beasts. These were not the tools of a warrior, but of a sorcerer, of someone who dealt in shadows and nightmares. And yet, as much as he tried to push the doubts aside, they continued to gnaw at him, eating away at his resolve. Was this truly the right course of action? Was he so desperate for victory that he was willing to abandon all principles, to align himself with forces he did not fully understand? The faces of his fallen soldiers haunted him, their eyes filled with a silent accusation, a question that he could not answer. They had fought and died for him, believing in the righteousness of his cause, in the honor of his leadership. But what would they think now, knowing that their king had turned to the dark arts, to the creatures of the wild, in his quest for victory? Cyrus shook his head, trying to dispel the thoughts that plagued him. He was a king, a ruler who had built an empire through strength and determination. He could not afford to waver now. Not when the stakes were so high. Babylon had to fall. There was no other option. But still, the seed of doubt had been planted, and no matter how hard he tried, he could not uproot it. He had always prided himself on his ability to make the hard decisions, to do what needed to be done, no matter the cost. But as he stood on the precipice of this new, uncharted territory, he found himself questioning whether the cost might be too high, whether the victory he sought might come at a price that he was not willing to pay. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting a pale glow over the encampment, Cyrus knew that there was no turning back. The die had been cast, the course set. He would follow Ninmagus's plan, would see it through to the end, and hope that the darkness he had invited into his heart would not consume him before the final battle was won. For in the end, victory was all that mattered, and if he had to sell his soul to achieve it, then so be it. But even as he made that silent vow, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning, a reminder that some battles were not won with swords and shields, but with the strength of the soul. And in that moment, Cyrus could not shake the feeling that he was walking a path from which there would be no return, a path that would lead not to glory, but to ruin. And as the sun rose on the day that would determine the fate of Babylon, the shadows in Cyrus's heart deepened, the line between right and wrong blurring until it was no longer visible. The war was not over, but in the silence of his chamber, Cyrus knew that he had already lost something far more precious than any city. He had lost himself. The summoning of the beasts and the bargain with monsters. The night sky was a tapestry of darkness, woven with the faintest glimmers of starlight. A cold wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of ancient magic and the promise of bloodshed. Deep within the heart of the Persian Empire, at the edge of a vast and ancient forest, the air crackled with an unnatural energy, a force that had not been felt in the world for centuries, a power that belonged to the realms of legend and nightmare. Ninmagus stood at the edge of the forest, her dark robes billowing around her like the wings of a great black bird. Her eyes were closed, her lips moving in a silent incantation as she summoned the creatures that dwelled within the shadows of the world. The magic she wielded was old, older than the mountains, older than the stars themselves, a magic that had been forbidden by the gods, a magic that twisted the fabric of reality and called forth the primal forces of the earth. As she chanted, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble, a low, rumbling growl that echoed through the forest like the heartbeat of some ancient beast. The trees shivered, their branches swaying as if in fear, and the very air seemed to thicken, pressing down on the land with a suffocating weight. From the depths of the forest, they came, creatures of legend, beasts of nightmare, drawn to her call by the irresistible lure of her magic. They moved through the trees like shadows, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, their bodies massive and powerful, lions with manes like fire, their golden eyes burning with a fierce intelligence, tigers with stripes that seemed to shift and dance in the darkness, leopards with spots that blended seamlessly with the shadows, bears with massive paws and jaws that could crush bone. rhinoceroses with horns as sharp as spears, elephants with tusks that gleamed like ivory in the moonlight, and gorillas with muscles that rippled beneath their fur, their eyes filled with a dark, cunning intelligence. These were not mere animals. They were the embodiment of the wild, the primal forces of nature that had roamed the earth since time immemorial. They were creatures of power, of instinct, of hunger, and they were bound to the will of Ninmagis, drawn to her by the ancient magic she wielded. As they gathered around her, the air grew colder, the wind picking up and swirling around them in a vortex of dark energy. The beasts, though fearsome and wild, stood still, their gazes fixed on Ninmagis as they awaited her command. She opened her eyes, the darkness in them matching the night around her, and her voice, when she spoke, was a low, melodic whisper that carried through the forest like a chill. "You have answered my call," Ninmagis said, her voice as smooth as silk, yet laced with a power that sent shivers down the spines of even the fiercest of beasts. "You have come to serve me, to fulfill the purpose for which you were created. Tonight, we march on Babylon. Tonight, the city of kings will fall, and you shall feast upon the flesh of its people, revel in the destruction of its walls." The beasts stirred at her words, their eyes glowing brighter, their bodies tensing with anticipation. They could sense the power in her words, the promise of blood and carnage that awaited them. They were bound to her will, their hunger for flesh and blood fueling their desire to obey her commands. Ninmagis raised her hands, her fingers tracing patterns in the air as she began a new incantation, her voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the wind. The air around her shimmered with power, the very ground beneath her feet vibrating with the force of her magic. The beasts growled in response, their breath visible in the cold night air as they awaited her command. "Go now," Ninmagis whispered, her voice like the hiss of a serpent. "Go to the edge of the forest and wait. When the time comes, you will know what to do. You will strike without mercy, without hesitation. The walls of Babylon will crumble, and its people will be yours to devour." The beasts turned as one, their massive bodies moving with a fluid grace as they disappeared into the shadows of the forest, their eyes glowing like embers in the darkness. The ground trembled beneath their weight, the trees swaying as they passed, and soon, the only sound was the whisper of the wind and the distant rustle of leaves. Ninmagis watched them go, her eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. The city that had once been her home, that had cast her out and left her to rot, was now at her mercy. But the beasts were only the beginning. There were others she needed to summon, others who would join her in the destruction of Babylon. With a final, commanding gesture, Ninmagis turned away from the forest and began her journey to the mountains, to the place where the monsters dwelled, the creatures of nightmare, the ones who had been forgotten by time, hidden away in the darkest corners of the world, the lair of the monsters. The mountains rose like jagged teeth against the sky, their peaks shrouded in mist and shadow. The air here was cold, colder than the night in the forest, and the wind howled through the narrow passes like the wails of the damned. This was a place of darkness, of death, a place where few dared to venture. But Ninmagis was not afraid. She had come to this place with a purpose, and she would not leave until that purpose was fulfilled. The lair of the monsters was hidden deep within the heart of the mountains, a vast network of caves and tunnels that wound their way through the rock like the veins of some ancient, slumbering beast. The entrance was marked by a pair of massive stone pillars, their surfaces carved with the symbols of the old gods, the gods who had ruled before Marduk and his kind. Ninmagis stood before the entrance, her eyes narrowing as she studied the carvings. She could feel the power that radiated from the stone, the remnants of the ancient magic that had been used to seal the monsters within their lair. But she was not deterred. With a wave of her hand, she summoned her own magic, the dark energy swirling around her as she began to chant in the language of the old gods. The ground beneath her feet trembled, the air growing heavy with the weight of her power. The carvings on the pillars began to glow, the symbols pulsing with a dark, eerie light. The stone itself seemed to groan in protest, as if resisting the magic that sought to undo the seal that had held the monsters in check for centuries. But Ninmagus was relentless. Her voice rose in a crescendo, the force of her magic pressing down on the ancient seal until, with a deafening crack, the stone shattered, the pillars crumbling to dust as the entrance to the lair was revealed. A wave of cold, foul air rushed out of the tunnel, carrying with it the stench of decay and death. Ninmagus stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with dark triumph as she entered the lair, her steps echoing through the darkness as she descended into the heart of the mountain. The tunnels were narrow and winding, the walls slick with moisture and covered in strange, glowing fungi that cast an eerie green light over the rock. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rot, and the distant sound of dripping water echoed through the caverns like the ticking of some ancient, unseen clock. But Ninmagus pressed on, her footsteps steady and sure as she made her way deeper into the lair. She could feel the presence of the monsters, their dark energy pulsing through the rock, growing stronger with every step she took. They were close, closer than they had been in centuries, and soon she would stand before them, would offer them a bargain they could not refuse. Finally, she reached the heart of the lair, a vast, cavernous chamber that stretched out before her like the belly of a great beast. The walls were lined with jagged stalactites, their sharp points dripping with moisture that pooled on the floor in dark, stagnant puddles. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and decay, and the ground beneath her feet was soft, yielding, as if it were made of something other than stone. At the center of the chamber, a massive stone throne rose from the ground, its surface carved with the symbols of the old gods. And seated upon that throne, shrouded in darkness, was the chief of the monsters, the one who had taken the name of Namtarsar, the one who had inherited the mantle of the Monster King who had fallen in the battle against the gods. Ninmagus stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the figure seated upon the throne. The darkness that surrounded him seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a writhing, seething mass of shadows that obscured his form, hiding him from view. But Ninmagus was not intimidated. She had come too far, had sacrificed too much, to turn back now. With a wave of her hand, she summoned a ball of light, its pale glow piercing the darkness and revealing the form of the monster that sat before her. Namtarsar was massive, his body covered in thick, scaly hide that gleamed in the light of her magic. His head was crowned with a pair of twisted horns, their surfaces etched with the symbols of the old gods. His eyes, glowing with a malevolent red light, were fixed on Ninmagus, his gaze filled with a deep, ancient hatred that sent a shiver down her spine. "You dare to enter my lair, sorceress?" Namtarsar growled, his voice a deep, rumbling growl that echoed through the chamber. "You dare to disturb the slumber of the monsters? What do you seek, mortal? Speak, before I tear you apart and feast on your bones." Ninmagus met his gaze without flinching, her voice steady as she replied, "I seek an alliance, Namtarsar, an alliance that will bring down the walls of Babylon and deliver the city into your hands." Namtarsar's eyes narrowed, his massive form shifting as he leaned forward on his throne. "Babylon? What do I care for Babylon? It is a city of men, a city of weakness. I have no interest in such things." "You may not care for Babylon itself," Ninmagus replied, her voice calm and measured. "But you care for the power that lies within its walls, the souls of its people, the treasures of its kings. These are the things you desire, are they not?" Namtarsar let out a low, rumbling laugh, the sound like the grinding of stones. "You think you can bribe me with gold and souls, sorceress? You think I can be swayed by such petty offerings? These are no ordinary souls, Namtarsar," Ninmagus said, her eyes gleaming with dark intent. "These are the souls of the Babylonians, the people who worship the gods who defeated your kind in the ancient wars. Their souls are filled with power, with the essence of the divine. Imagine the strength you could gain from devouring them, the power you could wield if you consumed the essence of the gods themselves." Namtarsar's eyes gleamed with interest, the red light in them growing brighter. "And what of the gods themselves, sorceress? What of Marduk and his kind? They would not stand idly. by while we feasted on the souls of their followers. The gods are preoccupied with their own battles, Ninmagus replied smoothly. They have their own wars to fight, their own enemies to contend with. They will not intervene, not until it is too late. And by then, the souls of Babylon will be yours, and the city will be in ruins. Namtarsar was silent for a long moment, his massive form still as he considered her words. Finally he spoke, his voice low and dangerous. And what do you gain from this, sorceress? Why do you seek the destruction of Babylon? Ninmagus smiled, a cold, calculated smile that revealed nothing of her true intentions. Babylon was once my home, Namtarsar. It is a city that cast me out, that betrayed me. I seek its destruction for the same reason you do, for power, for revenge. Namtarsar's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing as he studied her. You speak of revenge, yet you ask us to do your bidding. Why should I trust you, sorceress? Why should I believe that you will keep your word? Ninmagus's smile never wavered. You need not trust me, Namtarsar. You need only trust in your own power, in your own desire for revenge. The souls of Babylon are yours for the taking, the treasures of its kings yours to claim. All I ask is that you join me in this battle, that you lend your strength to the cause. Namtarsar was silent, his eyes glowing with a dark light as he considered her offer. Finally, he nodded, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a shiver through the chamber. Very well, sorceress, he growled, his voice like the rumble of distant thunder. I will join you in this battle, but know this, if you betray me, if you seek to claim the souls of Babylon for yourself, I will tear you apart with my own claws and feast on your flesh. Ninmagus inclined her head, her smile never faltering. You need not worry, Namtarsar. We both seek the same goal, and together we will see Babylon fall. With that, she turned and left the chamber, her footsteps echoing through the dark tunnels as she made her way back to the surface. Behind her, the ground rumbled, the air growing thick with the dark energy of the monsters as they prepared for battle. The stage was set, the players ready. Babylon's fate was sealed, and soon, the city would fall into darkness, consumed by the power of the beasts and monsters that Ninmagus had summoned. But even as she made her way back to the forest, her mind was already turning to the next phase of her plan, to the moment when she would confront Ira, when she would finally exact her revenge on the city that had betrayed her. The night was dark, the wind howling through the trees as she stepped out into the open air. The beasts were waiting for her, their eyes glowing in the darkness as they gathered at the edge of the forest, ready to march on Babylon. And as Ninmagus looked out at the distant lights of the city, she felt a cold, dark satisfaction settle over her. The time was coming, the moment when Babylon would pay for its sins, when the city would be brought to its knees. But there was still work to be done, still preparations to be made. The battle was not yet begun, and the night was still young. With a final, commanding gesture, Ninmagus sent the beasts forward, their massive bodies moving with a fluid grace as they began their march toward Babylon. The ground trembled beneath their weight, the air thick with the scent of blood and death. And as the beasts disappeared into the darkness, Ninmagus stood alone at the edge of the forest, her eyes fixed on the distant city that had once been her home, her lips curling into a cold, cruel smile. The time was coming, the time for revenge.